So I was looking for a sculpture that would represent the Enlightenment, and the best I could do was this one, which actually was a 20th century sculpture of Booker T. Washington, who is not an Enlightenment era figure, but I think is very much, spiritually at least, an Enlightenment figure. This is the sculpture of Booker T. Washington at the Tuskegee Institute. But I want to talk about a couple other Enlightenment people. Deborah Feldman was born into an Orthodox Jewish community in New York City, where she was raised to defer, obey, and yield her will to the religious authorities who had planned out her life in advance. In her memoir, Unorthodox, she explains that she graduated early from high school, quote, because there was no point in wasting another year in pursuit of an education I didn't need. I would never be allowed to find work. Any effort invested in my education after this point would be a complete waste. At the age of 17, Feldman was put into an arranged marriage with a man she had known for only half an hour. She knew that there was something wrong with the society in which she lived. Once she became a mother, she yearned for an education. I was exhausted by the years I had spent pretending to be pious and chastising myself for my faithlessness, she said. I wanted to be free to acknowledge myself for who I am, free to present my true face to the world. So she enrolled at Sarah Lawrence, telling her husband it was for a business degree, and she found in literature a doorway into another world. She left the Orthodox community and became a best-selling author and journalist. A similar story is told by Yeonmi Park, who escaped the totalitarian slavery of North Korea in 2007. In her book, In Order to Live, she explains that every subject we learned, math, science, reading, music, was delivered with a dose of propaganda. In North Korea, it's not enough for the government to control where you go or what you learn, what you work, what you say. They need to control you through your emotions, making you a slave to the state by destroying your individuality, your ability to react to situations based on your own experience. After she escaped, she attended a school where, on one occasion, she was asked what her favorite color was. She found herself unable to answer. The very idea of having a favorite anything puzzled her. Why would anyone care about what I wanted, she thought. There was no I in North Korea, only we. It took me a long time to start thinking for myself and to understand why my own opinions mattered. Another intellectually heroic woman, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, has a similar background. She was born in Somalia and raised in Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Given a strict Muslim upbringing, she received a meager education, mostly memorizing the Quran. At last, she escaped to the Netherlands in 1992 and soon after enrolled in a university to study political science. She was impressed by how the Dutch valued freedom. 400 years ago, when European thinkers severed the hard bands of church dogma that had constrained people's minds, Holland was the center of free thought, she writes in her memoir, Infidel. The Enlightenment cut European culture from its roots in old fixed ideas of magic, kingship, social hierarchy, and the domination of priests, and regrafted it onto a great strong trunk that supported the equality of each individual and his right to free opinions and self-rule, so long as he did not threaten civic peace and the freedom of others. And here, this commitment to freedom took hold of me too. These stories are at once horrifying and inspiring, in that these remarkable women from such diverse backgrounds ultimately found freedom and a world of ideas and experiences to enrich their lives is a cause for celebration and for reflecting on how fortunate we are, those of us who did not face such daunting odds. And it's also cause for reflection on the millions of people today who still live in the silent, senseless darkness of ignorance and terror. But it's worth remembering that in the light of history, the experiences these women escaped are not only not rare, but are in fact how most people have lived for most of their lives in most of the nations of the world. Illiteracy, ignorance, poverty, hunger, and disease are by a wide margin the most common state of affairs in which humanity has found itself. It is only in the past 2 centuries that a portion of the human race has risen out of darkness into enlightenment, and it has done so in a manner very much like the stories these women tell. What I mean is that while these are stories of personal liberation and discovery, Western civilization as a whole went through something very similar on a culture-wide level beginning around 1700 in a period that we, appropriately enough, call the Enlightenment. This was a time during which intellectual leaders, scientists, philosophers, historians, politicians, began advancing a new way of thinking, one that emphasized reason and discovery rather than power and dogma. Their ideas were not entirely new, of course. One can trace their inspirations to Rome and Greece. Yet they transformed our view of human life. They inspired and fashioned a set of social and personal values that are almost solely responsible for the improvement of the condition of mankind in the past 2 centuries, and, more importantly, offered opportunity to countless people like Park, Feldman, and Hirsi Ali. The word improvement is hardly adequate. The transformation of the world in the past 200 years is so mind-bogglingly enormous that the English language does not contain powerful enough superlatives to describe it. Perhaps some small indication of the degree to which the ideas of the Enlightenment have improved human life might be given if we reflect that George Washington had more in common with Julius Caesar than he did with us. He lived in a world lit and warmed by fire, transported by sails and horses, written on paper, largely by hand. Washington, the greatest American, never did almost any of the things we consider quintessentially American today. He never ate a hamburger. He never listened to rock and roll. He never texted while driving. But let's get more specific. Since Washington's day, life expectancy has nearly tripled in Europe and the Americas. Diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, and polio have been virtually eradicated. Wealth has increased beyond our capacity to measure. As Steven Pinker puts it in his book, Enlightenment Now, quote, "In 1800, no country in the world had a life expectancy beyond 40. But an African born today can expect to live as long as a person born in the Americas in 1950 or in Europe in the 1930s. And thanks to life improving as well as life-saving medicines, people get more use and enjoyment out of their longer lives. In developed countries," writes Pinker, "out of the 4.7 years of additional expected life that have been added to the human lifespan, 3.8 were healthy years, meaning that people today live far more years in the pink of health than their ancestors lived altogether." Access to food has improved so much that in the United States today, obesity is a greater problem than starvation. And even in the poorest countries, the rate of undernourishment has fallen from 50% after World War II to about 13% today. In 200 years, writes Pinker, the rate of extreme poverty in the world has tanked from 90% to 10%, with almost half of that decline occurring in the last 35 years. Labor-saving machinery has improved life far beyond our capacity to appreciate. To take just one example, Pinker observes that the cost of light has fallen dramatically in the past 2 centuries. In 1800, an Englishman had to toil for 6 hours to burn a tallow candle for an hour. Today, you would have to work for a half a second for the same hour of light from a compact fluorescent bulb, a 43,000-fold leap in affordability in 2 centuries. Education has improved astonishingly as well. A century and a half ago, the average American had a little over 4 years of schooling. Today, it's closer to 14. But in even less developed countries like India, that number has risen from effectively 0 in 1870 to more than 4 today, meaning that people in New Delhi now are better educated than the New Yorkers were who were building the first skyscrapers. And this education isn't just rote learning. Intelligence tests reveal that people around the world are actually improving in their analytical thinking. Hard as this may be to measure, the evidence shows that humans don't just know more, but are increasingly adept at solving problems by applying intellectual skills. Along with these improvements has come an increase in happiness. Statistics show that 90% of Americans rate themselves as at least pretty happy, and a third call themselves very happy. There are some indications to the contrary, increasing levels of Americans reporting feelings of anxiety and depression, and even an increase in suicide. But this can be explained in part by our increased expectations from life. In Washington's day, a farmer who suffered a misfortune was likely to just die at the age of 35 and consequently cease to worry about things. Today, the average American lives twice as long and as a result has at least twice as many opportunities for disappointment and frustration. We are lucky enough to live in a world where we're angry that the Wi-Fi on Southwest rarely works and costs $8 a pop. This, incidentally, is the kernel of truth in the accusation that capitalism causes unhappiness. It does. in the sense that by improving the standard of living, it creates a situation in which there are more people living longer who are able, as a result, to experience and survive unhappy circumstances. But of course, they also experience joy, discovery, wonder, and flourishing. How did we reach this glorious, unprecedented, magnificent state of affairs? This explosion in the standard of living has its roots not in some accidental distribution of natural resources, but in the presence of certain intellectual and moral virtues. And it was these virtues that created the Enlightenment, and they are the same virtues that Burke, Hirsi Ali, and Feldman took such risks to embrace and to defend. The spirit of the Enlightenment might be summarized in a Latin maxim that the French philosophe Voltaire used as his personal motto, sapere aude, dare to know. Certainly that motto expresses the bravery of the women I've mentioned. But perhaps a better motto would be nullius in verba, which means don't take anyone's word for it. This is the motto of the Royal Society, the world's first scientific fraternity, which was founded in London in 1663. Intellectual leaders in this era strove to understand the world not in terms of command, but in terms of causes. In other words, natural phenomena resulted not from God's will, but from natural causation. And in a broader sense, they viewed knowledge not as the say-so of one's ancestors, but as the result of independent judgment. Judgment based not on habit, faith, or revelation, but on reason and experiment. During this period, Newton published his analyses of gravity and optics, Smith essentially invented economics, Jenner created the first vaccine, Franklin invented the lightning rod, Voltaire and Edward Gibbon wrote their path-breaking critiques of Christianity, and the concept of inalienable rights was born in the writings of Locke, Jefferson, and Paine. Even more profound was a change in the conception of what life is about. In his book, In Defense of the Enlightenment, the philosopher Tsvetan Todorov listed what he calls the three basic principles of the Enlightenment movement: autonomy, universalism, and what he calls the human end purpose of our acts. By autonomy, he means the right of the individual to make the choices that matter in his or her own life. By universalism, he means the search for values that do not depend on culture or circumstance, but on human nature. And this includes the principle of equality, whereby we respect that others have the same right to direct their own lives that we have. And by the human end purpose of our acts, he means a focus on pursuing ends in this world, rather than the alleged will of the gods. Where previous generations had viewed humanity as a component in a social, political, cultural, or religious machine, Enlightenment thinkers began to view human life in individualistic terms. They emphasized the individual's inherent value, his or her personal experience, knowledge, desire, and skill, and they believed that the reward for self-improvement, and especially for exertion in learning about the world and exercising our faculties in it, was to enjoy happiness. Just as proper diet and exercise requires us to obey nature, but comes with the reward that it also makes us feel physically healthier and happier, so the exercise of personal virtue, curiosity, and hard work makes us both better people and happier people. As Alexander Pope, the greatest poet of the Enlightenment, put it, reason, passion answer one great aim, that true self-love and social are the same, that virtue only makes our bliss below. Note that word below. Pope's concern was with our happiness in this world, not with the reward in the next. The purpose of virtue is not to appease the gods or to please kings or the tribes, but to enjoy a full and flourishing human life. The business of men, wrote John Locke, is to be happy in this world by the enjoyment of the things of nature subservient to life, health, ease, and pleasure. I want to focus on that word enjoyment, because enjoyment is a particularly Enlightenment concept. Previous generations had not held that enjoyment was a significant value in human life, either at the individual or the social levels. Individuals did not exist to enjoy their lives, according to the medieval era or to the Renaissance. They existed to serve God, often as manifested in the state. And they were expected to value submission, obedience, and subordination, and to strive to reconcile themselves to the dictates of heaven. Wishing to enjoy life simply because it is one's own, enjoying the experience of living for its own sake, was viewed as positively sinful. The Middle Ages had therefore celebrated such figures as St. Simeon Stylites, the early Christian mystic who sat meditating on a 50-foot pillar and smiled placidly as the maggots ate his flesh. This contrasts sharply with the Enlightenment ideal of enjoyment, which meant a tranquil sense of self-sufficiency, well summarized by George Washington's favorite Bible verse, Micah 4:4. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. When the Constitution speaks of domestic tranquility, it is referring to this fundamentally Enlightenment vision. This was a revolutionary idea. The Middle Ages or the Renaissance intellectual leaders virtually never celebrated this notion of enjoyment. St. Augustine uses the word enjoyment to refer to the duty that we supposedly owe God to perceive and respect the proper order of things in the supernatural structure of the universe, a concept that scholars call beatific enjoyment. In Shakespeare or the King James Bible, the word enjoy is typically used in the sense of consume, which comes closer to the Enlightenment notion, but is still significantly different. But in the Enlightenment, the word enjoyment takes on a distinct meaning. One 1780 dictionary defined it as pleasure arising from possession or fruition. Enlightenment enjoyment is a distinctive kind of happiness, not greed, but satisfaction in ownership, particularly the possession of knowledge. It's a type of pleasure in settled proprietorship, experienced by a person as conscious magnanimity or serenity. And the concept of enjoying oneself is a joy in self-possession and self-control. In 1726, Ben Franklin wrote out a list of what he called the 13 virtues that encapsulate Enlightenment thinking on this subject. Now, the classic Renaissance virtues were humility, kindness, temperance, chastity, patience, charity, and diligence. But Franklin's list is temperance, silence, he says, avoid trifling conversation, order, by which he means organization, resolution, by which he means determination, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. And he writes here, imitate Jesus and Socrates. Now, there are several parallels here, but the differences are more revealing. Charity is absent from Franklin's list, although he considered some aspects of charity as belonging to justice. And diligence is replaced with resolution, the difference being that one can have a duty to be diligent at tasks assigned to one, but resolution is about self-chosen obligations. Most of all, while the Renaissance virtues are overwhelmingly concerned with duties owed to others, kindness, patience, charity, Franklin's are primarily concerned with the flourishing of the individual. This is even true of humility, which appears on both lists. Franklin adds, imitate Jesus and Socrates, when, in an important sense, neither of these men were at all humble. Socrates chose to be executed rather than buckle under the demands of the crowd, and even after he was condemned to death, he told the Athenian jury that they should give him a lifetime pension instead. Nor was Jesus particularly humble. He defied the Roman Empire because he said he was the Messiah. What Franklin means by humility here is hold truth as your highest value above all the riches in the world. Franklin's list reads more like a doctor's prescription than a list of commands. They're a prescription for enjoying life and for being worthy of that enjoyment. They're rational prescriptions for attaining happiness, not pledges to obey God's will or slogans about emotional fulfillment. And they're focused on self-control rather than self-expression. This self-control does not mean self-denial. Rather, it means the conscious discipline of devoting one's energies to rational and life-enhancing pursuits. Thus, the Enlightenment virtues for personal happiness and social flourishing emphasize curiosity, reasoned debate, intellectual comradeship, and respect for cultural differences. By respect for cultural differences, the Enlightenment thinkers did not mean relativism, that no culture is better than another. Rather, they respected cultural differences by acknowledging that culture is the product of contingent historical circumstances and does not reflect permanent, insurmountable differences between people. This was another crucial Enlightenment value, the concept of a common universal humanity. Where previous generations had thought of mankind as bound within tribal circumstances, the Enlightenment sought to understand the commonality among human beings. The reason European Enlightenment figures were so fascinated with other cultures, Native Americans, Polynesians, Asians, was because they hoped to find in these diverse peoples evidence of deeper, universally human moral and political values that would cross cultural boundaries. To summarize then, which is very hard to do given the immense complexity of the historical trends that we're talking about, the Enlightenment was an era that prioritized humanity, that sought universal moral values rooted in human nature rather than tribal background or circumstance, and that pursued answers to scientific and philosophical questions through reason, skepticism, curiosity, experiment, and free speech. And the purpose of all of this was the individual's enjoyment of this life. To return to the heroines with whom I began, consider how their lives reflect the principles of the Enlightenment. They felt within themselves the need for something other than obedience and drudgery. They sought a world of autonomy, universality, and the human end purpose of their acts. A world they could comprehend and in which they could direct their own lives as they chose, in which they could practice the Enlightenment virtues of resolution, industry, sincerity, right? Humility in Franklin's sense, holding to truth at all costs. A world in which they could make the choices themselves on the basis of their own rational considerations rather than supernatural or totalitarian command. Although they came from backgrounds where such desires were penalized or deterred, where all the forces of the church and state were leveled against their longing to become who they knew they could be, their yearning for freedom could not be abolished. The caged bird, as we all know, sings of freedom. But it is that very singing for freedom that has led and still leads some intellectuals to oppose the Enlightenment movement. And this hostility to the Enlightenment comes from directions that we tend today to call the left and the right, although these terms can be misleading in this context because the differences are superficial at best. Whether described as culturally on the right or the left, today's opponents of the Enlightenment are spokesmen for the counter-Enlightenment movement that we call Romanticism. Romanticism rejects the Enlightenment's hard-nosed realism and retreats into spiritual mystery, or to be more precise, into mystique. It is hard to define Romanticism precisely because of this slippery mythological quality, but Isaiah Berlin described it in terms of three doctrines. First, that the fundamental function of human beings is self-expression. Second, the notion of belonging, specifically belonging to a group. And the third was the notion that ideals, true ideals, are often incompatible with one another and cannot be reconciled. This irreconcilability means that all we can do is dedicate ourselves to essentially arbitrary values with our full beings. And that belief manifested itself in an emphasis on authenticity, the breaking of boundaries, and the irrepressible impulse, that is, passion, as opposed to moderation or comprehension or the humane application of reason to solve life's problems. Now, you may notice a subtle conflict between the first two items on Berlin's list. One paradox of Romanticism was that it seemed simultaneously individualistic and collectivistic. It celebrated bold and iconoclastic individuals, but also generated such collectivist doctrines as Rousseau's general will or the German concept of the Volksgeist. But the paradox is easily explained because the Romanticists celebrated not the individual's application of reason, but the expression of identity. And the source of that identity was incomprehensible and innate impulses, whether in the form of allegedly supernatural revelations or emotional drives and gut feelings. In short, the Romanticist prized wildness. And just as animals in the wild often gather in herds, so the Romantics saw nationalism and tribal identity as the source of the genuine self. Thus, the self-expression of Romantics was often the expression of collectivist ideals, so-called national spirit or Volksgeist. When each nation develops and forms itself in accordance with its own peculiar quality, wrote the Romantic philosopher Fichte, and when each individual develops himself in accordance with that common quality, then and then only does the manifestation of divinity appear. The Romantics distinguished civilization, which was an artificial construct of reason and therefore inauthentic, from culture, which expressed the ineffable, mystical, hereditary forces of history in the people. The origin of Germanness, for example, lay in the misty race memory of the Volksgeist, in traditions and collective history that could not be subjected to rational analysis. This was what authenticity meant to the Romanticist, unlike the Enlightenment, which would have said that nothing can be authentic that is not in harmony with reason. The Romantics believed, and still believe, that civilization, language, and reason itself estrange us from nature, separate us from a transcendent or blissful union with the truly real. I want to emphasize this. Whatever their differences, what the Romantics shared was their rejection of the Enlightenment idea that reason, experiment, and persuasion should enable us to make use of the world and improve human life. The Enlightenment held that civilization protects us from nature. The Romantics believed that it alienates us from nature. What I've called the left-wing variety of Romanticism is based on the writings of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau famously wrote that man is born free but is everywhere in chains. But Rousseau believed that these chains were self-created, and they were created in particular by reason. In his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, he fashioned a story, a new creation myth, that explains why people today are unequal. In the beginning, he wrote, natural man in his primordial state was in harmony with nature. Savage man, he wrote, was intelligent and enlightened, indeed a very philosopher capable of investigating the sublimest truths, end quote. But then came the catastrophe that ended this Garden of Eden. That was, anybody? Language, the invention of language. Language was evil because it gave mankind the tool to understand his condition, to imagine a better world, to create civilization, and therefore to be unhappy. You're right if you said reason, right? The Greek word logos covers both. That is the quintessential evil in Rousseau's mind. A free being such as a primitive man cannot possibly suffer, argued Rousseau. But in civilized society, we see around us hardly a creature who does not lament his existence. Suicide, he says, only occurs in modern civilized society. I ask if it was ever known that a savage took it into his own head when at liberty to complain of life or make away with himself. Rousseau celebrated the primitive because in a pre-civilized world, there was, he claimed, no distinction between mine and thine, between happiness and unhappiness, between man and nature, nor is there any internal strife. Primitive man is free of self-contradiction and therefore happy. He is ignorant of vice because he has peaceful passions. He is moved by compassion and generosity because he does not think about tomorrow but lives for today. He does not desire things he doesn't need. He lives in harmony with nature. So much so, Rousseau tells us, that wild animals in the jungle will not attack him. That harmony, I'm not making this up, that harmony has been ruptured by the invention of language, which is to say the advent of reason. Such corrupt notions as selfishness and private property are merely a consequence of reason because it has tamed man, destroyed his wildness, and therefore created inequality, jealousy, and misery. Rousseau, in short, is the patron saint of hippies, and to some extent of Disney movies. It is from him that we get today's primitivist hostility to civilized society, technological progress, and what postmodernists call the cultural hegemony of reason. Rousseau argued that now that we are suffering in a world infected with the evil of reason and selfishness, our own solution is to obliterate these premises, that is, to destroy what Rousseau himself regards as the foundations of civilization, and to substitute a new society based on natural passions instead. In this new tribalism, government will not be distracted by selfish concerns, but will achieve what is best for the tribe's members. And if the tribal members are still distracted by selfishness, the tribe will punish them in order to ensure that the general will of the group is vindicated. Today's left may not like to admit that their ideas were created by a dead white European male named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but that is the case. Many prominent environmentalists, for example, are outspoken enemies of technology who idealize primitive lifestyles for their alleged harmony with nature, as we were just talking about, and condemn technological improvement even when it's cleaner than the alternative because it alienates man from nature. Especially guilty here is the postmodern left, which not only denounces the Enlightenment for disrupting the harmony and equality that primitive man allegedly enjoyed, but even objects to the word primitive on the theory that value judgments of that sort are imperialistic and racist. Primitive life is just another mode of living, and we should not judge or impose reason, science, and discovery on other people. Of course, to suggest that people in other less prosperous nations are somehow better off without the blessings of science and reason, or that they prefer to live without them, is a form of projection that truly is oppressive. The Rolling Stones, of all people, captured this form of anti-Enlightenment thinking quite well in the lyrics of one of their songs. You say poverty is picturesque as you drag your nails across my chest. You're so cold, you're so cruel. Yes, indeed. The cultural left has embraced the idea that there are different epistemologies. One culture's way of knowing is just as valid as another, and to argue that reason is superior to mythology and superstition is, to their minds, a form of bigotry. One revealing example of this appeared recently at an event in New York, where school administrators were undergoing racial sensitivity training. They were shown a slide that listed the elements of white supremacy culture, and among them are perfectionism, individualism, objectivity, either-or thinking, seeing things in terms of good or bad, right or wrong, black or white. Worship of the written word, which prioritizes writing skills rather than the ability to relate to others. Objectivity, individualism, the written word, etc. These are, of course, the foundations of all civilized society and are present in any culture committed to the values of autonomy, universality, and humanism, let alone of enjoyment. It seems never to have occurred to the creator of this slide that people who are not white can also be objective, individualistic, and perfectionist. This is worth emphasizing because the universality of the Enlightenment is principally concerned with the idea that values like these are not confined to any particular cultural, racial, or historical background, but can be embraced by all human beings, and that their beneficial consequences, objective science, individual flourishing, an ever more perfect world, can be enjoyed by peoples of all races everywhere. That is why people as diverse as Ayaan Hirsi Ali from Somalia, Yeonmi Park from Korea, and Deborah Feldman from New York can be drawn to these values. Only a racist would suggest that these values are off limits to them, or that they were too deluded to realize that they were white supremacists all along. Only a sexist would imply that these feminist heroes, by consciously embracing the Enlightenment legacy, are somehow male chauvinists. There is, of course, no truth to the premises of the Rousseauian worship of the primitive. Native cultures are not the environmentally conscious societies they're portrayed as, but are often astonishingly wasteful and unsanitary. So-called natural man does not live in harmony with nature, but in constant warfare against it, and suffers anxiety as an almost constant state. He faces a daily struggle for subsistence. His life is at the mercy of the weather, of his religion, and of wild animals who, contrary to Rousseau, do indeed attack humans. As for primitive man's treatment of women, it is almost uniformly brutal. From the Cherokee of 19th century Georgia to the Yanomamo people of the Amazonian rainforest today, women in primitive societies are treated as beasts of burden and breeding stock. And as far as cultural relativism is concerned, it's interesting, isn't it, that cultural relativism is only a phenomenon of Western intellectuals? Cultural relativism is not found in native cultures elsewhere in the world. Turning now to what I've called the right-wing romantics. They share with the Rousseauians their belief that human reason has alienated us from the authentic order of the universe, but in their case, the authentic order is the hierarchical structure of society. This structure reveals the divine will through the ineffable workings of cultural tradition. The divine right of the king, or nowadays the divine right of your local community, exists so as to bring order to the chaotic world of natural man. Reverence for tradition is the critical social value, and science and reason are to be despised for upsetting these long-standing habits. And habit is just the word for it. These reactionaries believe that reasoned deliberation about justice is dangerously corrosive to society. A good example of this kind of thinking is the 20th century romantic D.H. Lawrence. In his 1923 book, Studies in Classical American Literature, Lawrence talked about a scene in Richard Henry Dana's book, 2 Years Before the Mast, in which Dana wrote about witnessing a sailor brutally flogged by the captain of the ship. Dana bemoaned the brutality and injustice of that punishment, but Lawrence thought Dana had it all backwards. "It is good for Sam to be flogged," wrote Lawrence. "It was a passional justice. Mechanical justice even is a foul thing. For true justice makes the heart's fibers quiver. You can't be cold in a matter of real justice. Sam got no more than he asked for. It was a natural event. The sailors understood spontaneous, passional morality, not the artificial ethical." Artificial ethical, that's a good phrase. It precisely describes what the Romantics believed, that rational conceptions of justice are paltry and inauthentic, whereas passional morality is the genuine article precisely because it is not rational, but arises from the gut or from social traditions. This hostility to the Enlightenment is rooted in the writings of another author, the British politician Edmund Burke, whose famous book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, was published a century before Lawrence was born. In his book, Burke lamented that the Enlightenment had destroyed the age of chivalry and had replaced it with an era of sophisters, economists, and calculators. Nevermore shall we behold that generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of the heart which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of an exalted freedom. Burke's euphemisms are important here. By focusing all of his poetic, blurry-eyed sentimentality on such phrases as the age of chivalry, and disregarding the harsh material reality of the oppression, ignorance, and misery of which pre-Enlightenment world actually consisted, Burke was playing a trick on his readers. And I mean trick quite literally. There is one particularly revealing phrase in the passage from Burke that I have read. The age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded. Note the word economists. At the time Burke wrote this, the science of economics, what was then called political economy, was a new idea. This idea, represented most famously by Adam Smith, was that economic and political institutions could be understood not in terms of mysterious, indefinable, emotionalistic notions like chivalry, but in precise and rational terms, such as contract or rights or property, supply and demand, efficiency, and that these things could even be measured. Sophisters, economists, and calculators are people who believe that politics, morality, and other aspects of life can be understood in humanist terms and can be debated as rational, comprehensible values. To view government as an institution that serves human needs, rather than as a mysterious, divinely ordained order hovering in the midst of such vague concepts as chivalry, was an immense innovation. And that is what Burke was denouncing. By lauding the age of chivalry and denouncing sophisters, economists, and calculators, what Burke was doing was essentially arguing that the government is like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, and that people like Smith or Thomas Paine were ruining the effect by pointing out that it's a trick. In Burke's eyes, the magician's hocus pocus is just what government is. And to point that out, or to try to explain to the audience what the magician is really doing, was a threat to the passional morality and the mystique of the age of chivalry. Burke was remarkably candid about this. He was opposed to what he called the empire of light and reason, because it would, quote, rudely tear off all the decent drapery of life, furnished from the wardrobe of a moral imagination to cover the defects of our naked, shivering nature. Less euphemistically, Burke believed that government consists of power and subordination, which must be pleasantly disguised with drapery. Now, I was looking for a good artistic representation of rudely tearing off the decent drapery of life. And that is what that is. Burke admitted that the age of chivalry that he was celebrating was a pleasing illusion, but he believed that it was worth preserving because it had, without confounding ranks, produced a noble equality and handed it down through all the gradations of social life. Boy, I love that word, noble. Not actual equality, but noble equality, which did not eliminate the gradations of social life. In other words, every person in this feudalistic society knew his place and didn't seek to escape it. This is what Burke meant when he celebrated, quote, the proud submission, the dignified obedience, the subordination of the heart, and that servitude, which somehow or another embodies the spirit of an exalted freedom. Read that sentence in the voice of a 19th century Southern slave master, and its barbaric and cruel essence becomes clear. Today's followers of Burke still oppose the Enlightenment legacy for the same reason, because it seeks to ameliorate suffering, ignorance, and risk. Most of all, because it values enjoyment. Consider, for example, one of the more prominent conservative enemies of the Enlightenment today, Sohrab Ahmari, who recently wrote in the journal First Things that the Enlightenment is responsible for, quote, the eclipse of permanent truths, family stability, community solidarity, and much else, and has led to the pornographization of daily life, to the culture of death, to the cult of competitiveness, end quote. Like Burke, Ahmari deploys these euphemisms carefully. After all, to the Burkean, euphemisms are what politics is about. So let us rudely tear them away. When he writes of permanent truths, Amari does not mean the natural rights of mankind, let alone the economic forces of supply and demand or the scientific laws of biology. He means religious dogma handed down from an established church. When he speaks of family stability, he does not mean harmony attained by respecting and nourishing the value of every family member. He means the subordination of each one to unchosen obligations, the prohibition of the right to marry to large portions of our society, and the opposition to the right of unhappy spouses to divorce and to value their own flourishing and happiness along with their family commitments. When he speaks of communal solidarity, he means the right of the community to sacrifice the happiness and freedom of individuals within that community, to censor people, to dictate how they may use their property and what jobs they may take, to tell them what books they may read and what movies they may watch. And when he denounces the cult of competitiveness, he means the right to excel, the right to aspire, the right to pursue happiness and achieve one's dreams. He is mounting a direct attack on the value of enjoyment. When Amari denounces what he calls the fetishizing of autonomy, his meaning is unmistakable. Individualism, the right of the individual to his or her own life, is his primary target. Amari and his admirers pledged themselves to a society of, in Burke's words, submission, obedience, subordination, and servitude, and they do it while wrapping themselves in the American flag. This becomes obvious in another First Things article that Amari recently praised, in which the author, Archbishop of Los Angeles Jose Gomez, speaks, believe it or not, of, quote, recovering the Hispano-Catholic founding of America, which enjoyed a much wider geographic sphere and cultural span than did the Second Anglo founding, end quote. Think about that sentence for a moment. When the author speaks of the wider geographic sphere of this so-called Hispano-Catholic founding, he's referring to the colonization and enslavement of the Americas by the Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors in the 15th century. Have the nations of Central and South America benefited as much from that founding as we have from ours? Is the political culture of Catholic Central America as prosperous, safe, and free as ours? The answer, of course, is no. The Hispano-Catholic founding was rooted not in peace, freedom, commerce, opportunity, and the enjoyment of human happiness, but in the exploitation and subordination of human beings for the alleged glory of God. The Founding Fathers were quite open in their hostility to that form of Catholicism, which they rightly saw as profoundly cruel, corrupt, and inhuman. Yet Gomez, amazingly enough, writes that the true founding of America came not on July 4th, 1776, when America's founders pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to conceive a nation in liberty and the right to pursue happiness. No. It came on December 9th, 1531, when a peasant in Mexico had a supernatural vision of the Virgin Mary at Guadalupe. I kid you not. He writes, quote, Guadalupe is the true founding event in American history. We are all children of Guadalupe, and Guadalupe gives us the true history of America. In God's plan, this hemisphere was chosen as the site for the building of a new world of faith. The way forward for our church and our country is to return to Guadalupe, end quote. One might expect to find such nonsense written on an anonymous MySpace page by a bearded fanatic in a shack in the woods, but no. This was published in the prominent conservative journal First Things as something to be taken seriously. But let us give these writers at least this much credit. They are not lukewarm. Amari and Gomez openly admit the conflict. On one hand, the freest, happiest, wealthiest civilization ever built, one that welcomes people of all races and all backgrounds, one constructed on the universal human values of reason, individualism, objectivity, and opportunity, and on the other hand, the dreary, tyrannical poverty, ignorance, and slavery of the 15th century Catholic New World colonies. The choice is reason and flourishing on one hand, and mysticism and subordination on the other. Which should we choose? Well, this audience knows the answer well enough. The Enlightenment culture is the culture of life. Its values of autonomy, universalism, curiosity, humanism, that is, of reason, are what has lengthened, enriched, and even created life in ways unheard of in all of the eons of human existence before the Enlightenment. Those who would romanticize the anti-Enlightenment cultures from which Feldman, Hirsi Ali, or Yeonmi Park fled on the grounds that they give people a sense of tradition, community, and belonging, or shield them from the cult of competitiveness, are celebrating something deeply inhuman. Now, having said this, there is something worth admiring in Romanticism, specifically its art. Much of the art and literature of that era is moving and beautiful, thanks largely to the Romantics' fascination with a kind of individualism. In fact, Ayn Rand called herself a Romanticist in aesthetics. But objectivism is unique in subordinating the passions of the Romantics to the belief in reason characteristic of the Enlightenment. This is something Rand's critics often overlook. In her essay, The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made, she made it clear, quote, "To rebel against the metaphysically given, as Romanticism does, is to engage in a futile attempt to negate existence. On the other hand, to accept the man-made as beyond challenge is to negate one's own consciousness. Serenity comes from the ability to say yes to existence." Now that last sentence is particularly keen. Serenity is a quintessentially Enlightenment value. It is the type of enjoyment that the Enlightenment philosophers pursued. But the phrase, say yes to existence, is a literal translation of the phrase Ja-sagen, or yes-saying, which Friedrich Nietzsche used to refer to the fundamentally Romanticist embrace of life. By combining these two things in a single sentence, Rand is celebrating the reason of the Enlightenment with the passion of Romanticism, which is virtually unique in the philosophical world. Where the Enlightenment celebrated self-control and the Romanticists celebrated self-expression, Rand held that self-control is a form, indeed, the only genuine form of self-expression. I submit that this was the vision that motivated the heroines with whom I began this talk. When Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Yeonmi Park, and Deborah Feldman decided that they were not on the path that they knew was right, when they sought the opportunity to apply their own minds to the problem of living, to pursue happiness and realize their talents and virtues, they devoted themselves to that vision as much as any hero of Romantic literature. But their goal was not the mindless, primitive impulses of Romantic philosophers. It was a rational vision of the free and self-disciplined mind. They did indeed disrupt the family stability and communal solidarity that had been foisted upon them. They sought a world devoted to individualism, objectivity, either-or thinking, the written word, and so forth. They sought a world of autonomy, universality, and the human end purpose of their acts. They did indeed seek to rudely tear off the drapery of life in which they had been smothered. They did this to seek their rational happiness as free and independent beings because they know that their lives and their minds are their own, and that the enjoyment of their own lives is a value to be nurtured and celebrated. They are better for it, and so are all of us. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer your questions now. Thank you very much. Let's get to some questions.
Thank you so much for that. So I study institutions and their impact on development. So my question is, do you think that the modern institutional framework that draws its roots from Enlightenment and some of the other things that you talked about, applicable in other geographic regions, as those societies have not gone through that transformation naturally?
Right.
What's your take?
No, that's a great question, and it's really the question that I think preoccupies the world today and has since before September 11th, 2001. Can the institutional structures developed by the Enlightenment be applied in other societies? There's like Reverend Lovejoy says on The Simpsons, the long answer is a yes with an if, short answer is a no with a but. The answer is that there's no metaphysical reason why they can't be applied in other cultures. Absolutely none. In fact, one of the great, beautiful things about capitalism is the way in which it allows different cultures to approach these institutional frameworks and put their own spin on it. And that's what creates the wonderful diversity in a free market society. Now, there are no really free market societies today, and least of all San Francisco, but I'll use San Francisco as an example. One of the things, I was in San Francisco yesterday. One of the things I love about San Francisco is that intersection in Little Italy and Chinatown. And you're standing there in this three-way intersection. And on one side is Little Italy, and all the light poles have the Italian flag painted on them. And then this way, there's signs that are in English and Chinese. And then this way is the Transamerica building. And that kind of vibrancy and life occurs precisely because those frameworks can work for other cultures in unpredictable ways, in ways that may rock us, those of us who aren't very familiar with other cultures. Now, that said, there are plenty of man-made reasons why those institutional structures can't work in other countries, and particularly if they don't grasp the philosophical foundations on which they're built. And the values that I talked about came first. These values, things like autonomy, universality, and things came about first before the institutional structures were put on top of them, and required sometimes violent war and revolution to create the institutional structures. So yes, in the long run, I do believe that the world will be free someday, but devil's in the details. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
The sculpture that kept showing, lifting the veil of ignorance. Where do you find it physically, and can you tell us a little more about it?
Yeah, I don't know much about the artist, but it's a sculpture of Booker T. Washington, and it's the centerpiece at the Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University. Tuskegee, of course, was founded by Booker T. Washington as an educational opportunity for Black Americans during the period from 1890 or so. I think he founded it sometime in the 1890s. I don't remember the exact year. And it still is a historically Black college today. And it depicts Washington pulling the veil of ignorance away from a newly freed slave. The slave is depicted as sitting on top of an anvil, and his chains have just been broken. And Washington was this great figure who believed very much in self-reliance, in learning and education and hard work as a way for advancing the plight of Black Americans. Now, his great critic was W.B. Du Bois, another famous Black intellectual, who condemned Washington because Washington was seen as collaborating with segregation. And that debate between Du Bois and Washington is probably the greatest, most interesting political, philosophical debate of the 20th century, I think. And no side is completely right. But I will say Washington gets really a short shrift in today's culture, and I would very much recommend, there's a marvelous book called Up From Racism. That's a biography of Washington, came out just a few years ago. No, Up From Slavery is the title of Washington's autobiography, but this is a biography that, by a guy named Robert Norrell, and it really vindicates Washington against these charges that he was just essentially an Uncle Tom. It's terribly unfair. Yes, sir.
Hey, in your talk, you talked about the right wing of Rousseau and other thinkers there, and then the left wing of Rousseau and other thinkers there. And you talked about Sora Mamari and in First Things, and you reminded me of him going back and forth with David French in Commentary Magazine.
Right.
Could you explain how the left wing of Rousseau and the right wing of Rousseau have kind of come together in National Socialism?
Oh yeah, absolutely they do. And I think I wouldn't have enough time to give it a full justice, but yes, Rousseau is a very conservative thinker, really. In that he believes very much in this idea of a static society that is bound by that culture's indigenous traditions. And probably, I mentioned that I mentioned who Burke's most prominent spokesman was. I would venture to say that the most prominent Rousseauian intellectual of recent years is Russell Kirk, which is may come as a shock to some people, mostly Russell Kirk, who claimed to despise Rousseau and who falsely accused Thomas Jefferson, of all people, of being a Rousseauian. There's no evidence that Jefferson even read Rousseau. But it's actually Russell Kirk who is, at least until recently, was the godfather of conservatism and teaches this sort of anti-development, pro-traditional kind of attitude. So I would certainly say, and it certainly is connected to National Socialism in the sense that National Socialism is this idea that, instead of a socialism for everybody in the world, it's just socialism just for us, right? Now, the Nazi version of National Socialism, of course, is a deeply reactionary, anti-modernist attitude, which I think is more associated with the right than the left nowadays. However, the environmentalist movement is very much of the same. That's why you see groups like the Crunchy Cons that was popular in recent years and things like that. I get a little bit into this, by the way, in my new book on the biography of Jacob Bronowski, which is just available. So, yes, sir.
Thank you.
Hi. I wonder if you can comment some on ways in which the Enlightenment was, in some places and times, taken. It seems that people took some ideas and not all of them.
Yeah.
The Soviet communists, for instance, loved the scientific production thing, weren't so big on the individualism. David Deutsch says there was like a British Enlightenment versus a continental Enlightenment. The Continentals were more
Very
like
true.
Platonic idealist.
Yeah, a lot of thinkers, like, I don't know if Deutsch does this, but a lot of thinkers will classify Rousseau as an Enlightenment thinker. In fact, Todorov does that. Rousseau is one of those figures like Beethoven, who kind of straddles two eras, right? Beethoven he's a classicist, but he's really the beginning of the Romantic music. And Rousseau is kind of like that. I categorize him as a Romanticist because of that, what I think is the fundamental philosophical distinction, which is his view that civilization alienates us from nature, as opposed to protecting us from nature. I think that's the quintessential difference there. But yes, it is certainly true that many people at the time, and this is true of all historical periods, took some of these new Enlightenment ideas, but clung to older traditions in other ways. The most obvious and disgraceful example of that is the pseudo-scientific justifications for slavery that began around the turn of the 19th century. You see this in Jefferson, for example, in Notes on Virginia, when he offers a scientific explanation for what he says is the inherent inferiority of black people. And he says he advances it as a supposition only. It's an interesting line because, of course, he could have 30 or 40 years later, he didn't have to say that. He could have said the nastiest thing possible about black people, and it would have been fine in that culture in the 1830s. But at that time, he's right on the tip of it. And when you read it, you can get this sense that he knows it's not quite right, but he offers it anyway. And I think in any society, we have plenty of these today. Any society, you have the people who take part of it, but not the rest of it. The one that springs to mind are the people who, pardon me, but they claim to, quote, fucking love science, end quote. But at the same time, they're opposed to GMOs and nuclear energy and so forth, right? There are such skeptical, scientifically minded, rational people, but oh my God, we can't have nuclear power, So now you find that in every civilization, and I don't claim that I'm immune to sometimes clinging to ideas that I probably should let go. But I try to work on it. None of us are perfect, but be as rational as you can be. That's the point of all my lectures. Be as rational as you can. I could have saved you all 45 minutes. Just come here, be as rational as you can be. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Throughout your entire talk, I was trying to get a glimpse of your T-shirt, and I imagined that it probably had
yes, you must have been late. I showed off where it says, "I am my ancestors' wildest dreams."
And how do you relate that to your talk?
Well, I'm very glad you asked that, because one problem that I had in preparing this talk was I wanted to talk about how to make the Enlightenment a part of your life, which is hard to do because I think most of the people in this room are already committed to the idea of making the Enlightenment part of their lives. They probably already do a lot of it, and I didn't want to come off as Polonius up here or Grandpa. You kids today, this is what you need to do, or something like that. But I did want to say that I think the key to happiness generally, but also this is a key to really grokking the Enlightenment, is, as I heard on the radio the other day, cultivate an attitude of gratitude. It's very easy in today's culture to get a very pessimistic view of the world. You read the news and it's like negative. It can be really a strain on you. And one reason I love Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, and I urge you all to get it, and it's just an amazing, magnificent, marvelous book, just for the first 250 pages. After that, you can throw it away. Yeah, I mean, it's good, but those first 250 pages, all he does in that first 250 pages is lay out the statistics of how much better we are now, much better off we are now than we were 200 years ago, and not even 200 years ago. One of the most astounding things about his book is how much we've improved in just the last 50 years, about how people today, the poorest people today, are better off than the richest people were only 40 years ago. It's incredible. And when you look at the actual statistics of things like, let's take these mass shootings, for example. Mass shootings are incredibly rare, incredibly rare. You don't get that from the news. From the news, you get that it's, it's a daily occurrence and you're going to be killed and your family's going to be killed unless you vote Democrat, blah, blah, blah. But things are better for human beings today than they have ever been in the history of the world. And if you really, one of the great benefits of knowing history is that it helps you to really appreciate how good you have it. And that attitude of gratitude it will carry you through life and really help you to take the downsides. It sounds trite, especially when I say it in a rhyme, but really it's important. Another aspect is, I think, and this, okay, I'll be grandpa after all. For you kids out there, for you young folks, one of the things that I think is a problem is you want to be fully 100% passionately devoted to something, and so there's a tendency to throw yourself wholly into something, and that's a wonderful thing, but also try to cultivate this value of tranquility, which was a great Enlightenment idea. The idea of serenity, of calm harmony with your life. That is a much more long-lasting, much more stable, much more, in the long run, rewarding attitude to have toward life. There's this great line in Romeo and Juliet where he says, "These violent delights have violent ends." I've written this down because I knew you were going to ask this question. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph, like fire and powder, which as they kiss, consume. Right? And he's right? That's the Friar Lawrence saying, love moderately. I'm not telling you to love moderately. Love is one thing that probably shouldn't be done moderately, but it should be done wisely. And by wisely, I mean cultivate a sense of calm tranquility. You will find, if you observe happy old married couples in restaurants, they don't talk a lot. They sit at the table together and they don't talk a lot. And I remember seeing a cartoon once that showed this young couple at a table looking over at this old couple who weren't talking a lot, and the young woman says, "Oh, how sad." You have no idea. It's exactly the reverse, right? So when I say I am my ancestors' wildest dreams, my grandfather was born in poverty in San Saba, Texas in 1924. He grew up picking cotton and pecans, and when I knew him shortly before he died, he was a lumber delivery man. And here I am being given the privilege of talking to all of you about my life. So that sense of gratitude and appreciation, it will make you a happier person, and it will make people around you a happier person. Generosity is an overflowing of spirit. After you're satisfied and tranquil with yourself and your experience, then the generosity will flow from that. And the key to that sense, that fundamental sense of tranquil repose, is the sense of gratitude and appreciation and calmness in your life. Okay, I've ranted too much. Thank you very much.